There seems to be an awful lot of sad stories in the news today, and there are thousands missing. Does anybody care? We built a channel where we talk about those faces. Talking News. Debbie. Cassie Barons has still not been found, and it's been 2 years since her case first hit the spotlight. Againt, child Daybell and Lori Vallow both behind bars. Sarah Galloway was found. She wasn't found alive. What happened to Sarah Galloway?
It's too heartbreaking to share.
Children are still missing. Children like Dorsey, you're in shape. You just got away with it. Welcome to Talking News, Mother and everyone. My name is Debbie. We use big stories to push little faces.
Chasing a man.
San Bernardino, California. In the 1980s, it was a nice place to live. It was considered the white picket fence neighborhood, the place to raise a family. It was known for its competitive background in every aspect, including the local schools. It was the place that made hard-working folks proud to be an American. Sadly, just 20 years later, San Bernardino is voted one of the most dangerous places to live in America, and in 2012, it went bankrupt following the leadership of Clinton, Bush, and Obama. Like so many American towns in that time, So, needless to say that San Bernardino, California filed Chapter 9 protection and is still in Chapter 9 protection today. And most of their manufacturing companies are gone and they continue to leave. But before that, this once thriving town really started to die out. It was the place to raise a family, especially in the 80s. Americans had chosen to move there in order to live that proud American dream in that strong built community. At the time, it is mostly occupied by Christian and Jewish people, but it was once a thriving hub for Mormons. In fact, San Bernardino was always an interest to Mormons. Brigham Young had once purchased 35 acres back in 1851 of this prestigious property. And once they occupied that area, they had their ups and downs. But at some point, Brigham Young recalls the Mormons back to Salt Lake City. Some of the Mormons went back, taking great financial losses to do so, while a handful of other Mormons opted to remain and struggled to continue on their own in the area. And what few people understand is the Mormons were the ones that actually built San Bernardino, the ones that were left behind. And they established schools, stores, and a network of roads and a strong government. And this helps us understand why, perhaps, a family that makes headlines, a Mormon family by the name of Cox, decides to build a family in San Bernardino. Janice Connor and Barry Cox get married in 1965 in Sacramento, California. Shortly afterward, they moved to San Bernardino and start a new life. The two are very devout Mormons and they stick to themselves pretty much. But they are active within their community to an extent. Like most Mormons, they have a large family. And they live in the San Bernardino area for years. And all 6 of their children were actually born in San Bernardino County. They have Alex Cox, which was the joker / protector. Adam, who is the DJ. Stacy, the devoted mother. and future mother to Melanie Boudreaux, Laura Lee, Lori, the prophet, and Summer, the baby of the family. But we will focus on two children mainly attached to this family. In 1973, Lori Noreen Cox is born in San Bernardino, California, and would grow up to headline news attached to a very tragic story for years. Then Alex Cox, who is Lori's brother, who you will hear she refers to often as her protector. Lori, the third daughter born after Stacy, who dies of medical complications, and Laura Lee, who died at 6 weeks. Lori had an eye for spotlight, and she also was very married to her religion, which come before anything else. Growing up in the Cox household, they strived to be a close family who went to church regularly. And the Cox family seems to fit in their surroundings quite perfectly, unless you took a closer look. It seemed, at closer glance, they didn't trust government, and they didn't like to follow rules. They are very anti-government, and this is something the Cox kids would grow up understanding and living. The Cox children grew up in a strict environment with daily Mormon studies, which taught their children early in their lives not to trust the United States government, and that they were very anti-government. And this might play a role in her later life and how she relates, how she acts, and handles certain situations. Barry Cox and his wife Janice have spent decades fighting with the Internal Revenue Service, racking up more than $300,000 in back taxes. And as I mentioned before, that has to do with the federal income tax is unlawful to him and his wife, and IRS is a rogue agency. In fact, Lori Cox's father, Barry Cox, would pen a book on how not to pay taxes, and that refers to, quote, the IRS cabal, end quote. It accuses it of imposing an evil regime on Americans. So in other words, he believes that the IRS is like a secret society bleeding the working people for their hard-earned dollars. Barry Cox represented himself in Arizona as his own attorney, which led to Barry's being reprimanded by an Arizona judge for engaging in unauthorized practice of law. And this was just in 2018. Barry studies the law, looking for those loopholes that can benefit him. This includes crossing state lines, which makes it hard for a prosecuting state to indict him during that time. This is something that his kids, especially his daughter Lori Cox, will learn to play later in an attempt to escape the law. So the Cox family raises their children in California from 1984 to 1991. And we're going to focus on Lori Cox. Lori grew into her teenage years, and she grew into an attractive young woman. She was slender, blonde, and known to her Mormon beliefs, at least according to one of her friends, or cheermate, Lopez. Lori attended Eisenhower High School, and according to Lopez, Lori was a bombshell, and she was a lot of fun to hang out with. According to Lopez, Lori kept her fellow cheermates in hysterics of laughter. Lori attended Eisenhower High School from 1987 to 1991, and she was a cheerleader that her teammates admired. And Lopez says they admired her for her Barbie doll looks and her ability to make life fun, though she didn't drink or do any drugs like teens did in the 80s. Though Lori was a cheerleader, she wasn't known by many people within her school. She was only known by a small group. But to her cheer squad, they knew her pretty well. In fact, Lori was the flyer on her squad, or the girl you seen thrown in the air during cheer routines. Eisenhower High School is a proud high school They even make a video bragging about the students attending the school. Like many of the schools in the area, they're known for their competitiveness and carry a very high pride. And this school would lead its population of approximately 2,400 students in grades 9 through 12, who they would try to lead toward a grand victory. I believe this is where Lori will learn a lot of her traits of being competitive. The 80s was big on student parties and dabbling a bit in alcohol and drugs, and MTV had taken over the airwaves. According to her friend Lopez, Lori, each day before school started, while other kids were just waking up and getting ready for school, the Cox children were already up and going to attend like Mormon education classes before school started. Lori's teammate Lopez mentioned in news articles saying that the Cox family was close. She was close to her parents, but her parents didn't seem to attend events their children partook in. Something Lori's friends noticed was that fact that Lori's parents didn't come to her cheer competitions. But Lopez says that didn't seem to bother Lori. She mentioned that oftentimes the Cox family would host Lori's friends at their home, inviting them over to sleep or to have a swim in the pool. During her time at Lori's house, she did notice that they did have a Book of Mormon. They just didn't seem to be pushy about their beliefs at all, nor did they seem to judge others for theirs. They were just blending in best they could. According to Lopez, Lori Cox had plans to attend BYU after her high school graduation. Lopez quoted in a news article saying, quote, "Being a Mormon, this is what I got from her. They already knew she was going to be a missionary for a couple of years and serve," end quote. In an important statement that you need to keep with you, this entire story is, quote, "She already had a plan," end quote. The plan is a key word that will attach to Lori often throughout this story. Laura Cox is growing into a young woman and begins to take notice to a boy that goes to her high school. He is an average height, dark hair, and doesn't seem to have much in common with Lori. According to her friend Lopez, Lori really didn't start dating until her senior year, so it's interesting to see her fall head over heels over the first boy she really dates. And I'm not going to use their entire names, some of these men that she has been involved with. We're going to just refer to him as Nelson. There's not a whole lot known about Nelson other than he did marry and have children later after he and Lori split up. In 1991, Lori graduated, but she had no interest in celebrating it with her fellow students. Lori had other interests, and at that point, Lori's focus was all on that boy, Nelson. And Lori was that statistic of the 80s. Right after she graduated high school in 1991, nearly a year later in 1992, Lori marries her first husband, Nelson. A few of her friends speculate as to why she married him so quickly. A lot of them they believed that it was because she wanted to have an intimate relationship. But I've never found anything to prove that. Sadly, that marriage didn't last long, and not too many people know about the intimacies of this relationship between Lori and Nelson. They believe that the failure of this marriage is because of her Mormon beliefs, and that Nelson just wasn't one to want to convert and become a Mormon and share the same faith and ideas of the future as she did. Even back then, the rumor is that her faith was her priority. And it seems to be a possibility since every other man in her life after this will convert to Mormon or is Mormon. And they're very active within the church. So Lori's married about 6 weeks to Nelson, and then it's annulled. As soon as she's divorced, it's not long, and she's dating another guy. It's also around this same time that they moved from California to Texas. Her parents were living in Texas in 2005, and a 4-bedroom, 2-bath, 2,700 square foot that sold in 2008 for $341,000. Just a few years out of high school and one divorce later, October 22nd of 1995, Lori is getting married for a second time. Lori had also attended a beauty school, learning to be a hairdresser. When Lori met this handsome young man at age 22, his name, we're going to just call him Goya. He was 23. And they're in a very rough relationship that's on and off for about 4 years. Some speculate that she might have gotten pregnant first, but there's no proof of that either. So Goya is the son of a cop, but he carried a bad boy image. When Lori marries Goya in Travis County, Lori also moves in with him and his parents. According to affidavits that are written out by Lori later, Goya is struggling to hold down a job, and this drives one of the wedges between this very young couple. And if you were to read it from Lori's point of view, Lori is working very, very hard trying to make this relationship work, more than most of her relationships, as you will see. Through my research, in my personal opinion, it appears that Lori seemed to have a really big physical attraction to Goya, as well as a very small mental attachment. Interestingly, Goya he was an extreme narcissist based off of what I've learned off the affidavit, and he seemed to be extremely manipulative, which is something we kind of see Lori as. During their marriage, she calls the police several times to report abuse. Because I'm not able to get their side of the story, all we have is what Lori shares. So knowing the way Lori is, you can take this very lightly. 3 months before she married William, she was caught up in a fight. Supposedly, Lori was also pregnant. So July 16th of 1995, an affidavit says that Goya is accused of hitting Lori in the head with his hand, causing her lip to swell. And they were living on Bluff Springs Road during that time. It also claims that it caused her lip to swell, and then he throws her on the bed. The affidavit says that Lori had a co-worker there who was there to witness this. And an investigator by the name of Michael said he did witness that Lori's lip was swollen and indeed had a cut and trauma inside her mouth. So perhaps it was quite an abusive relationship. Lori says, during our relationship, I prayed that he would accept my religion, repent for his carnal, selfish, and sensational behavior, and become a Christian. Lori had left him multiple times already, and she says, he told me that the separation had caused him to think about things, and that he had been studying with the missionaries, and he wanted to change his life and accept God and get marriage counseling and psychological therapy. So during this separation, she's describing how much Goya is really reaching out, trying to change his life so that she would come back into his life. She says he added that he had received counseling and had repented for his past wrongful deeds. Goya begged me to please attend his baptism in Bracksville and give him one more chance to prove that he can change. And he promised me that he would take responsibility as the man of the house and pay the bills. In parentheses, she says primarily the car payments, so that I could stay home and take care of our baby. She continues as a practicing Christian, I endeavored to forgive Goya for his previous assault on my person and decided to forgive him and offer him an opportunity to prove that he had changed for the better. I thought that my baby needed his daddy, and I wanted to be a complete family. It's at that point she says that she goes back to Bracksville. It's on July 13th of 1996. She says, I drove myself and my 3-month-old baby, whom I had by myself with no husband and without any mental or emotional or financial support from my husband or his family. Looking back now, I was very naive because later I found out that my husband Goya deceived me and lied about his change of heart. He was actually living with another woman in Austin and using her car and sleeping with her and letting her pay all the bills. His modus operandi of womanizing to get gain. He knowingly and intentionally conspired to defraud me into quitting my job, where I earned about $45,000 a year annually, to come and live with him and his parents in Bracksville, where he would work and take care of us, pay the car payment, and all the household bills. He said he wanted and needed a wife and a baby, and that he would need to drive a car to work. He took advantage of my good faith, my charity, and my vulnerability or situation. When I moved in with him again, he immediately resumed his old ways. He took the keys to my car against my will, and he hid my spare key so I could not access it. The car was purchased by me, and it is registered in my maiden name, Lori N. Cox. To my disappointment, Goya took possession and custody of my car. He had never paid a penny for any of the payments, and he used the car for his personal agenda and leisure. He did not allow me to drive my own car. Every time I would ask to leave and go back to Austin, my husband would fight with me and physically hold the keys away from me. He kept me imprisoned at his residence. November 1996, 4 a.m. In early November, while my husband was passed out drunk from a one-night stand with a new girlfriend of his, and while he was sleeping, I escaped and left at 4 a.m. in the morning with my child. I was able to leave because my husband was passed out and his family was asleep. I snuck out, drove to my parents' house in San Antonio, Texas. Then my husband called me every day for 2 weeks, begging me to come home, saying that everyone missed me and the baby, that he and I were family and we needed to go to church and work things out. Foolishly and in good faith, and because I was desperate for help, I was taken in by his sincere efforts to turn a leaf and change his ways. So I went back to Bracksville to give him one more chance to salvage this marriage and to show me evidence of his change of heart. I also wanted to return to get my clothes. I wanted and needed my belongings for me and the baby, and they were in his possession. He also promised me that if things didn't work out, then I would be free to leave and take the car and possessions. All the promises turned out to be lies. A few days after my return, I expressed my unhappiness living in the house with Goya and his parents and requested to leave because things had not changed for the better, and I felt threatened and imprisoned. Again, my father-in-law, V, became violent and made verbal threats against me. He told me I was free to leave, but I could not take the baby. He was emotionally out of control and called me an unpleasant name and falsely accused me of things which I never did or said. Goya's father continued yelling and screaming at me, and he told me what a horrible person I was for wanting to leave and protect me and my baby, and said that if I did not like his mandate, then I could take him to court. Immediately I responded that, quote, I would never leave without my son, and that I would stay and try to work things out and make peace because I felt threatened for my baby's safety, end quote. V then stated, V says, quote, listen up, because I'm going to say this once. If you ever leave again in the middle of the night and take the baby, Colby, then I will charge you with kidnapping. And I will charge your whole family with harboring. And don't think I don't have the authority to do it, end quote. Lori continued, fearing for my safety and the baby's, I pretended to be subordinate. And I agreed to stay. About a week later, my husband and I were supposed to visit my parents in San Antonio for the holidays so that I can earn some extra money for doing Relato's hair. I'm a hairstylist. I enticed my husband, Goya, to bring me and my baby to my parents' house. When we got there, I refused to go back to his parents because of the threats his father made. Goya was not repentant. He continued to be abusive, immature, and irresponsible. My husband then requested to take my car and drive himself to his house. He promised, however, that he would return my personal property and the baby's belongings back to us in San Antonio in just a few days. He promised that he would return my car. The car payments were now 3 months delinquent, and Goya never got a job, never kept this promise of financial responsibility, and never paid any payments on the car. He said he would have a friend follow him to San Antonio when he returned my car, and his friend would then pick him up and take him back to his parents' house. Goya did not keep his word to return my car or my belongings, so I and my baby suffered deprivation. Goya also used my baby's welfare card, Lone Star, for his own personal expenses. And I want to note that's interesting because she claims she made $45,000 a year. And in that time period, that would have been very good money. I called him repeatedly every day for the next week and a half to ask him to bring my belongings and return the car. He made extensive promises that he would keep his word, but he lied again. He ignored my request. I must be a slow learner because I finally realized that Goya is a liar, and he has no respect for God, for truth, or law. Another interesting comment that she's making about law because she doesn't like law herself. He and his stepfather, V, have a core of beliefs and their own rules of life that are antisocial and despicable. They have no conscience of guilt or wrongdoing. They believe that they can lie and cheat and conspire to do evil or break the law and gain without any consequences. Their behavior towards me is unconscionable. My personal credit is now damaged and my car has been repossessed. I called Sheriff Burgess in Brackettville and asked for his help and escort me and my father when I return to Brackettville and go with me to the house of V. Goya and agreed to help me retrieve my belongings, including the car that I thought she said was repossessed. That's interesting, right, guys? The sheriff telephoned V and said, quote, we're coming over to get Lori's things, end quote. When we got to the house, V was ramping and raving like an insane person, shouting profanities and making verbal threats to me and my father while throwing my belongings in the street. When I asked where my car was, he replied, quote, you're not getting your car, end quote. I called the finance company and the repo man came and picked it up. Now that makes more sense. It's not my problem, he said. She continues with, I knew he was lying. And he also lied to the sheriff and my father about the whereabouts of the car. The truth is that he was hiding the car about a block away with the intent to defraud me, the sheriff, and the finance company. V was out of control and in a state of mental and violent rage. He continued his foul and offensive language, shouting and accusing me of being a horrible person and causing him all kinds of problems. The truth of the matter is that I provided $300 per month for food to feed V and his family because he could not earn enough money to feed his own family. So when I left, it was like taking food out of his mouth. The day before I went to the Bracketville, I get my car and thanks. V called my parents' house. And she puts in parentheses, since the sheriff called and alerted him about our pending visit. Continues with, and said that he called to say that I had to come that day to pick up my things and give him $250 for an alleged phone bill at his house, which my husband was responsible for, or he would throw away my things. V then hung up the phone. I called the sheriff to alert him of V's behavior, and the sheriff then told me not to worry about V's threats, that he was full of hot air. When I confronted my husband with my father the next day, I asked Goya, my husband, where my car is hid. He told me that his father took the keys from him and left with the car. V continued screaming and yelling profanities at us. We ignored him and put my belongings in my father's car. And we told the sheriff that V was lying and hiding the car from us, that we wanted to file a formal criminal complaint. The sheriff said we would have to contact Tylee, a county attorney, to file that complaint. Then the sheriff suggested that we call a loan company and let them know where the car is. We then came back to San Antonio, called the loan company, and they told us that V had called them while we were driving back to San Antonio and told them that I left the car and that it was now in my possession. More fraudulent acts. V and Goya willingly and knowingly lied to the law enforcement officer while in the line of duty. They intended to defraud the finance company and keep the car for their own personal use and enjoyment without any incident or vested interest or ownership in my car, on the false notion that they could get gain and use my car, which they had stolen from me. They were assuming that they could use the car and defraud the finance company and blame me for the disappearance of the car. They tried to get me in trouble with the finance company by reporting false information about the whereabouts of the car for their own personal gain. Upon my request, the finance company or repo department called Sheriff Burgess and learned that the car was, in fact, still in possession and in custody of V and Goya, and that they had lied to him and concealed the truth from the sheriff to keep the car from sight. I reported the car to the finance company as being stolen by V and Goya. The car was picked up by the repo department, and my good name and credit worthiness is now damaged and in jeopardy because of Goya and his father and their efforts to defraud me and to commit criminal acts to prevent me from attaining my personal property. In addition, they committed unlawful acts against me and considered as false imprisonment of my person and property. I now submit this testimony of facts in this formal criminal complaint and ask that the county attorney to use full force of the law to prosecute Goya and B to the full extent of the law. The facts show that any reasonable person could conclude from the evidence that neither Goya, my husband, or V, his father, demonstrated any compassion for the well-being of me or my baby. They deprive me of my clothes, my personal belongings for me and my baby, which demonstrates that they are deprived of human kindness and compassion for the care of their own family members. In fact, the only inescapable conclusion that a reasonable person could make is that V and Goya intended to cause harm to me and my baby. Goya never paid one penny towards the care and support for me and my baby during the entire relationship. He is void of any consciousness or of right or wrong, and he lacks any virtue of good character. Goya's lifestyle is similar to a pathological liar and a psychopath. He sees no wrong in using people for any purpose to get gain for his own needs and ambitions. He is unemployed and unskilled and has no marketable skills. He lacks integrity or any desire to accomplish or live in a worthwhile or productive life. My family has been patient and kind to him and has offered him help and made gifts to him to see if he could get the message and example of human kindness. However, Goya is void of any light and intelligence to know the difference between right or wrong. Obviously, I am filing for divorce immediately. I also plan to file civil charges against the Goyas to recover damages. Under the penalty of perjury, I testified that the statements I made in this complaint and declaration are true, and I have evidence to prove the same. Signed, Lori N. Cox Goya. It's at that point that Lori does stick to her word, and she doesn't return back to his parents' house, nor does she continue the relationship with Goya in any way whatsoever. And what's interesting, it seems that the Goyas also had no interest of having or maintaining a relationship with Lori or Colby. This must be the drama that Lori's parents and siblings speak about that surround her as she ages and matures. It was definite that once Lori was angry, there's no turning back, no matter what. You get 3 strikes and you're out. And once she sets her mind to something, she's going to do it. This story is extremely confusing, and I've had a few people trying to watch the older videos where we covered the breaking news, but we hardly had details. We were doing the best we could. So in this video, even though we know a little bit more, it's still not that easy to tell. At this point, what I want to do is kind of introduce the second person involved with the story that is also behind bars, and that would be Chad Daybell. We will cover how, where he comes from, how he and his family evolved, and how they got to the point to where Chad and Lori meet. So we're kind of go back and forth so that we can kind of get to know these characters a little bit better. So while Lori's going through 2 divorces and she has 1 child and she's trying to make it on her own, we're going to jump back to Chad Guy Daybell, who was born August 11th, 1968 in Provo, Utah. His father was in the military. Chad was actually born during his dad's 2-week shore leave to Sheila and Jack Daybell. Like most military families, he rarely got to see his father. He said, quote, "Dad was gone to sea for long stretches of time, so Mom and I would drive around to Southern California in our own little Volkswagen Bug and see the sights," end quote. Chad says his dad gets out of the military when his dad's service in the Navy ended. He said they moved back to Springville, and his dad was offered a job at that Guaneva Steel Company and the coke plant. He said the steel plant is where they turn coal into pure carbon called coke. That was used for the steel making process there. This is where Chad grows up. And his father actually attends college while working nights, just trying to make ends meet and to better his life. While Jack is at work one day, there's an incident. Jack says that he hears his father's voice, his name is Keith, warn him not to go into a room. Luckily, he did not, because there was a 40-foot long conveyor belt system with all the structural steel supporting it had fallen from 20 feet above the ground. Chad remembers his father mentioning that he had a warning from a relative from the other side of the veil. Chad Daybell is in 3rd grade, and he writes in an autobiography his first brush with death. My first encounter with death came in 3rd grade, when my classmate, Randy Perkins, was helping his brother dig a cave in the foothills above town. The cave collapsed in on him, and he suffocated before his brother could get him out. They said that Randy was now in heaven, but I didn't really understand what that meant. And importantly, Chad mentions this. He says, "Death became a scary topic to me," end quote. Growing up, he played sports and he was competitive. But one year he was injured playing ball. He was told to stay on the couch, and he did that for most of the summer. This is where Chad says that he develops his love for books, stories, and reading. And in school, he had actually wrote his first novel. Interestingly, that was a murder novel, and he was only in grade school, guys, elementary school. He wrote, quote, "All this reading sparked a desire within me to give writing a try." In 4th grade, I hand-wrote a short novel entitled "The Murder of Dr. J and His Assistant." My teacher, Mr. Bushman, really liked it, and he had the school employee type it up. He says it was a fun story despite the gruesome title, and they put it in the school library so my friends could check it out to read. I even received a commendation letter from the Nebo School District Superintendent. I suppose it was foreshadowing my future career, end quote. Truly, looking at this now, he was foreshadowing the darker side further than he can ever anticipate. Chad continued to play sports after his injury, and as time went on, he noticed that everyone else was growing taller, but he seemed to have stunned. He was stopped. He really started thinking about, his growth issue and how this would affect his sports future. Obviously, he felt he might have had a shot at bigger things in sports. And I do believe that this would impact him in a negative way. Chad Daybell also talked about going hunting with his father and brother. He said, quote, "Dad would often take me hunting with him. During a pheasant hunt in 1980, I was only a child old enough to actually shoot a gun. I quickly put the gun on my shoulder and got the pheasant aligned in my gun sight. And just as Matt, which is his brother, stood up on the other side of the ditch, his head was only a few feet from the end of my barrel. In my excitement, I hadn't noticed him. All I heard was my dad and Paul shouting, 'No, Matt, no!' It was too late. I had pulled the trigger. We all heard the gun click, but the shot was not fired. Dad dropped to his knees in shock while we stood there in silence. Finally, Dad stood, took my gun. He popped the shell out of the chamber and examined it. The shell's primer, which was hit by the hammer to spark the gunpowder, was deeply indented. The gun should have fired. Matt should have been killed instantly," end quote. Now, what Chad says next is quite interesting. "If Matt had died, it would have really sent me into a tailspin, because by the time I started 8th grade and junior high, I was basically mad at the world. The friends I had previously walked to middle school with now took a different route to the junior high, and it felt like I didn't have any friends. He was also bullied. He said, quote, "In my workshop class, I became the target of a bully. He sat right next to me, and whenever the teacher left a room, this kid would pound his fist into my shoulder and back. I finally told the teacher what was happening, and he moved the kid away from me. But my self-esteem was pretty low. One day that spring, I was slowly walking home across the Memorial Park after school, and I saw a honeybee pollinating a dandelion. I peered at it for a moment, then smashed it with my shoe. I spotted another one, then another one. I got a strange satisfaction from it. I kept count, and after about a half an hour, I had killed 120 bees. As I was about to step on another bee, a masculine voice shouted in my ear, "Hey, stop it. Leave them alone." I jumped back and looked around, but there wasn't anyone in sight. I was really shook up because the man that sounded really angry. I walked in a circle for a minute, trying to make sense of it. Finally, I realized that maybe an angel was fed up with me killing God's innocent creatures. That incident helped me realize how pathetic I had become, and I decided to start making some better choices. End quote. At this point, Chad begins to read the Book of Mormon and takes it more seriously. He comes from a long line of Mormons. His mother attends church faithfully, but his father, between his hectic work schedule and schooling, just really never finds time. Chad says once he starts reading this book and taking it more seriously, quote, "My deacon's quorum advisor had encouraged me to read it. So I finally opened up the book and slowly made my way through it. The Isaiah chapters in the second Nephi really baffled me, but I pushed forward. Once I reached the book of Alma, I was really enjoying the story." End quote. He said he checked out a non-LDS book, and in that book he kind of found some things that were interesting. He said, quote, "I checked out a book from the library that talked about reincarnation, past lives, and I can remember the dark feelings the book generated in me. I knew the spirit was telling me, quote, 'This is false,' end quote." And this is something that Chad Daybell actually starts struggling with at a young age. He goes back and forth, trying to truly work hard at believing the Book of Mormon and that it's true. But he has these darker interests. He has these interests in ghosts and spirits. Quote, "When I finished reading the Book of Mormon, I wanted a spiritual confirmation that the prophet Moroni talked about at the end of the book. I knew Joseph Smith had prayed in a grove of trees, so I went into a field behind our house in the tall grass and prayed for a while. But all I got was a bunch of ant bites on my legs," end quote. In 1982, he describes, a bit of conflicting feelings and emotions that he has going on. Chad also believes that he's not going to live a long life, but he finally gets this sign. So he says, "Thankfully, the blessing made it clear I had a long, wonderful life ahead of me, and it was very comforting. It spoke about serving a mission and going to college and marrying a wonderful woman and raising a strong family. It also mentioned spiritual gifts that would be made known to me later in life that I could cultivate to bless the lives of others." During this time where he's trying to find out who he is and how he fits into life, his father is moving up in the LDS ranks. He had to start going to church because he felt guilty he wasn't able to go. And that's because he only had Sunday off and he used that to go hunting. But Chad said that he asked his mom, why didn't Dad attend church too? And so that was an eye-opener for his father, Jack. And his hard work obviously pays off because, he was called to serve the ward's high priest group. He said his family gathered at the Springfield stake offices for him to be ordained. It's a very exciting time for the family. He said, quote, "As we waited for the stake president to arrive, I noticed Grandma kind of jump in her chair, and she smiled slightly and looked toward the vacant chair. And I turned and gave her a curious look. She looked around for a moment, and she looked around a moment to see if anyone else was listening. Then she whispered in my ear, 'Your grandpa, Keith, is sitting next to me.'" And I believe that this incident here helps him start coming more comfortable with the fact that there is an afterlife. So at age 14, Chad actually accepts a job to help an older neighbor in his 80s and refers to him as one of his best friends in his life. He helps the guy every morning by dressing him and then undressing him at night for bed, and he receives a small reward or payment for this. And he does this, I mean, he is very reliable as a young person and does this job with everything he has, and he loves it. In return, he gets a lot of stories from this older fella. He tells him, cute little stories and gives him advice that he says he's able to take with a grain of salt, but there's a few of them that he finds quite useful. And one piece of advice that he found very useful was for Chad not to date any girls until after he has completed his missionary assignment. Quite interesting, really. So what I wanted to do is go ahead and stop here for now and end part 1. We will continue part 2 with the life of Chad Daybell, giving you the opportunity to seek clues as to why he is the man behind bars today. How is it this man that was loving his community and wanting to do good is now awaiting trial for 2 children remains found in his yard? If you haven't done it yet, please press like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Thank you for watching. See you soon.